The crystalline moon of Kethera had never seen anything like this before. Thousands of ships filled the sky above it, blocking out the stars. Warships from distant empires, sleek research vessels, even ancient colony ships that rarely left their home systems. They all came for the same reason, to watch the oldest living creature in the galaxy take his final breath. Down on the surface, inside a massive crater that had been turned into a ceremonial hall, Vraxthos the Eternal lay dying. The dragon was so big that his body stretched almost a full kilometer from his head to the tip of his tail. His scales, which once glowed bright enough to light up entire solar systems, had faded to a dull bronze color. Every time he breathed, the ground shook. Strange patterns of light flickered weakly along his spine, the same patterns that ancient alien races had used as star maps millions of years ago before they figured out how to navigate space on their own. Vraxthos was 10 million years old. Let that sink in for a moment. 10 million years. He'd been alive when most of the galaxy's current species were still swimming in oceans or crawling out of caves. He'd watched entire civilizations rise from nothing, reach incredible heights, and then crumble into dust. 4 to 7 major galactic empires had come and gone during his lifetime. He'd seen species evolve from tiny microbes all the way to advanced star-traveling societies, only to disappear completely, leaving behind nothing but ruins and mysteries for archaeologists to puzzle over. And now, after all that time, he was finally dying. The representatives from hundreds of different worlds stood in respectful silence as Arbiter Thelnox approached the dragon's enormous head. Thelnox was a being made of living crystal, from a species so ancient they measured their ages in terms of how many mountains had eroded during their lifetimes. Ancient One, Thelnox's voice rang out, automatically translated into 700 different languages at once. We have gathered as you requested. The Galactic Council awaits your final wisdom. Everyone leaned forward. They'd all come expecting something incredible. Maybe Vraxthos would reveal the location of the legendary vaults of the First Ones, where treasures beyond imagination were supposedly hidden. Or perhaps he'd share the secret to safely navigating through the deadly radiation at the galaxy's core. Some hoped he might even share his own genetic code, which had allowed him to survive in the freezing vacuum of space for millions of years without any kind of ship or protection. Vraxthos's eyes slowly opened. It was massive, the size of a small spacecraft, and when he spoke, everyone felt it in their bones. His voice was like the sound of continents grinding together deep underground. I have one request. The crowd waited, barely breathing. Find the human who knows my name. For a moment, nobody moved. Then confusion swept through the chamber like a wave crashing on a shore. People looked at each other with bewildered expressions. A human? What did humans have to do with anything? Ancient One, Thelnox said carefully, clearly trying to understand. Surely you mean your title? Everyone throughout the galaxy knows you as Vraxthos the Eternal. No, the dragon interrupted, and there was almost a hint of amusement in his grinding voice. Not my title. My true name. The real name I was given long ago. The name I haven't spoken out loud in over 4 million years. There is one human alive right now who knows that name. Find them. Bring them here to me. I will only share my final knowledge with that person and no one else. Ambassador Krell stepped forward. He was a tall, reptilian creature from the Zarthan Supremacy, a military empire that prided itself on logic and efficiency. Ancient One, with all due respect, what you're asking is completely impossible. Humans have only been traveling through space for about 200 years. In cosmic terms, they literally just got here. They're complete newcomers to the galactic community. How could any human possibly know a name you haven't said in millions of years? The dragon's massive eyes slowly closed again. Find them. You have one lunar cycle, which is about 28 of your standard days. If you cannot bring me this human by then, my knowledge dies with me. Forever. But what knowledge? Krell demanded, his voice rising in frustration. What could possibly be worth sending us on this impossible hunt? Vraxthos was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. Yet somehow, everyone in the massive chamber heard every single word crystal clear. Everything, he said. The pattern behind it all. The cycle that governs galactic history. Why some civilizations rise while others fall. Why certain species endure for millions of years while others burn bright and disappear in cosmic instants. And yes, since I know you're wondering, I'll also share the complete mathematics of faster-than-light travel that goes beyond quantum probability. The kind that allows instantaneous transit across any distance in the galaxy. No travel time at all. Just step through one point and emerge at another, billions of miles away, in the same instant. That announcement hit the crowd like a bomb going off. The murmuring turned into an uproar. Aliens of every shape and size started talking, arguing, gesturing wildly. Faster-than-light travel was the ultimate prize, the holy grail that every civilization dreamed about. Sure, they already had FTL drives that could cross the galaxy in weeks or months, but instantaneous travel? That was something else entirely. That would revolutionize everything. Trade, warfare, exploration, colonization, communication, the entire structure of galactic society would transform overnight. This is complete nonsense, Krell hissed to Thelnox, trying to keep his voice down but failing. The dragon's mind is obviously deteriorating. He's dying and confused. No human could possibly know anything relevant. They're practically children on the galactic stage. Nevertheless, Thelnox said firmly, with the kind of authority that came from being billions of years old, we will honor his final request. Send emissaries to human-controlled space immediately. Begin the search. As the representatives started filing out of the chamber, already arguing among themselves about where to begin looking and whether this was all a waste of precious time, none of them noticed the faint expression that crossed the dragon's ancient face. If a dragon could smile, that's what it would have looked like. Because Vraxthos remembered something they didn't know about yet. 4,000 years ago, by the way humans counted time, he'd been near a small blue planet, the third one orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. He'd been young back then, only about 1,000,000 years old, and he'd been injured in a territorial fight with another dragon. He'd landed on that planet to rest and heal, not expecting any interaction with the primitive two-legged creatures he'd observed from orbit. But one of them had found him anyway. A small human child, fearless in the way only children can be, carrying a simple clay pot filled with water. And that child had asked him his name. Now, after all these years, Vraxthos wondered if humanity even remembered that encounter. If they'd kept that story alive through 4,000 years of their rapid, chaotic development. If they still had that strange quality he'd noticed in them back then, the tendency to remember small acts of kindness and to preserve stories that didn't seem to have any practical value whatsoever. He supposed the galaxy was about to find out. Up in orbit, Captain Bennett of the Earth Alliance vessel Perseverance received the urgent message from the Galactic Council. He read it 3 times, then looked up at his communications officer with complete confusion written all across his face. They want us to find a human who knows an ancient dragon's true name. He shook his head in disbelief. Is this some kind of elaborate prank? No, sir, his officer replied. The transmission has been verified. It's definitely from the Galactic Council itself, marked Priority 1, highest level. Captain Bennett leaned back in his command chair and ran his hand through his hair. Well then, I guess we'd better start looking. Send an immediate message back to Earth Command. Tell them we need historians, linguists, anthropologists, mythology experts, anyone who studies ancient human culture and stories. What exactly should I tell them we're searching for, sir? Bennett looked at the image of the dying dragon displayed on his main screen. A creature that had existed since before humanity had discovered fire, before they'd built their first cities, before they'd even developed written language. Tell them we're looking for a name that shouldn't exist, he said slowly. A name that logically, no human being has any right or reason to know. He paused, watching the light flicker along the dragon's massive scales. And tell them that according to the Galactic Council, the future of every civilization in the galaxy might depend on us finding it. The human colony of New Vancouver had always been a quiet place, the kind of settlement where nothing particularly exciting ever happened. That all changed over the course of 3 chaotic days when alien ships started arriving by the dozens. First came the proud Chulari scholars in their flowing robes that seemed to be made of liquid light and connected directly to their nervous systems. Then the Zentarii investigators showed up with their 8 analytical eyes that could apparently see in spectrums humans couldn't even imagine. Even the elders came, being so incredibly ancient that they almost never left their home systems anymore because they found the rest of the galaxy too noisy and rushed. They all converged on Central University like it was the most important place in the galaxy, demanding immediate access to humanity's greatest experts on ancient history and languages and old stories. The university's administration went into complete panic mode trying to accommodate everyone. Dr. Helen Carter, who ran the anthropology department, suddenly found herself in the extremely uncomfortable position of trying to explain human record-keeping to beings whose civilizations had maintained absolutely perfect archives for literal millions of years. She stood in a hastily arranged conference room that was now packed with aliens of every imaginable shape and size. Look, I need you all to understand something fundamental about human history, Helen said, pulling up a holographic timeline. We don't have complete, reliable records of anything that happened before around 3000 BCE. That's only about 5000 years ago. Writing systems were just being invented back then. Before that, basically everything important was passed down through oral tradition, which means people just told stories to each other and tried to remember them. And honestly, a huge amount of that knowledge has been completely lost over time. Zixthara, one of the Tulare scholars, rippled with what the translation device rendered as pure disdain and disbelief. Oral tradition? Are you seriously telling us that your species trusted its most valuable and important knowledge to nothing more than biological memory? Unrecorded information, completely unverified, just floating around in people's heads. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying, Helen replied, keeping her voice patient even though she'd dealt with this kind of alien superiority complex many times before. That's how pretty much every human culture operated for most of our existence. Absolutely barbaric, Ambassador Krell muttered from the back of the room. He traveled all the way from Cathay specifically to oversee this investigation, and he clearly wasn't happy about it. No wonder you humans have no knowledge of the dragon. This entire search is obviously a complete waste of everyone's time and resources. But then a quieter voice spoke up. It belonged to Investigator Crix, the Zentarii who'd been mostly silent up until now, just watching and listening carefully with all 8 of her eyes. Perhaps not, she said thoughtfully, tilting her angular head to one side. Consider this, humans have only been spacefaring for approximately 200 standard years, correct? And yet in that relatively tiny amount of time, you've already established 73 colony worlds across multiple star systems. No species in all of recorded galactic history has ever expanded that rapidly from their first successful spaceflight. Maybe your so-called unorthodox methods actually have some hidden strengths that we're not seeing. Krell made a dismissive snorting sound but didn't argue further. Helen decided to push forward. Let's try to approach this logically and systematically. Vraxthos claims that a living human knows his true name, a name he supposedly hasn't spoken in 4 million years. That's obviously way before humans even evolved as a species. So either the dragon is confused or mistaken, which seems unlikely given his reputation, or he encountered humanity much more recently than 4 million years ago. Crix finished the thought, her multiple eyes focusing intently. When was the last documented time that Vraxthos traveled anywhere near your home solar system? Helen quickly consulted her computer terminal, pulling up astronomical records and cross-referencing them with the trajectory data that the Galactic Council had provided. According to our astronomy records and the flight path information you gave us, Vraxthos passed directly through our solar system approximately 4,000 years ago. Give or take a century or so. And his presence would have been visible to humans on your planet's surface. Absolutely visible, yes. His bioluminescence, the way his body naturally glows, would have been clearly visible to the naked eye for about 3 weeks straight as he passed through our system. So ancient humans definitely would have seen him, Crix said, and all 8 of her eyes seemed to light up with understanding. And knowing what I've learned about human behavioral patterns, particularly your species-wide tendency to name absolutely everything and to create elaborate stories around unusual events, they certainly would have reacted strongly to seeing something like that. Almost certainly, Helen agreed, feeling a spark of excitement starting to build. 4,000 years ago puts us right in the middle of what we call the Bronze Age. Multiple sophisticated civilizations were developing all around Earth at that time. Ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley Civilization, early Chinese dynasties. All of them had cultures advanced enough to observe and record unusual celestial events that they witnessed. Zixthara pulsed with continued skepticism. But you just finished telling us that your records from that historical period are incomplete and unreliable. They are incomplete, yes. But we still have fragments scattered all over the place. Cuneiform tablets baked in clay from Mesopotamia. Oracle bones with writing carved into them from ancient China. Hieroglyphics painted and carved all over Egypt. Oral traditions that were eventually written down centuries or even millennia later. Helen pulled up another holographic display showing examples of ancient texts. The real problem we're facing is that we'd need to search through all of that material looking for any reference to an unusual celestial phenomenon that moved through the sky and might have been described in terms that sound like a dragon or serpent. How many such references currently exist in your databases? Crix asked directly. Helen started scrolling through her comprehensive database, and her expression gradually shifted from hopeful to completely dismayed. Just in ancient Chinese records alone, we have literally hundreds of dragon references. Dragons were central to Chinese mythology for thousands of years, and they still are today in Chinese culture. The ancient Mesopotamians recorded all kinds of different celestial omens and strange things they saw in the sky. The Egyptians had their own serpent deities and sky gods. Without knowing exactly what specific thing we're looking for or what it might have been called. She trailed off, the impossibility of the task becoming clear. We need someone who knows all of it, Crick said with absolute certainty in her translated voice. Not multiple specialists each knowing their own narrow field. We need one person who knows every fragment, every ancient story, every possible linguistic connection across all of these different cultures. Does such a person even exist? Helen hesitated, thinking hard. Well, there are specialists in various specific fields, obviously. We have Sumerologists who only study ancient Mesopotamia, Egyptologists who focus entirely on ancient Egypt, experts in ancient Chinese language and culture. No, Crix interrupted firmly. You're not understanding what I'm asking for. We don't need narrow specialists. We need a true generalist. Someone who has specifically studied the connections between different ancient cultures, who understands how stories transform and change as they pass across time and distance. Someone obsessed enough and dedicated enough to have actually memorized things that the rest of your species has forgotten about or dismissed as unimportant. The room fell into thoughtful silence as everyone processed what Crix was describing. Finally, Krell spoke up again. Such a person would be considered rather strange by their own people, correct? An obsessive personality? Perhaps someone whose academic work is not particularly valued or respected by mainstream science. Helen actually laughed a little bit at that. We just call them academics, but yeah. You're basically describing someone who's devoted their entire career to studying dead languages and ancient mythology. Not exactly the most prestigious or well-funded field in a civilization that's focused on space travel and advanced technology. Most regular people consider that kind of work pretty impractical and pointless. Impractical knowledge. Crix made a sound that her translator device couldn't quite interpret or render into human language. Of course. Naturally, the humans who might actually save the entire galaxy would be the exact ones that their own society considers useless and irrelevant. I wouldn't go so far as to say useless. Do you personally know such a person? Crix interrupted directly. Helen thought for a long moment, then started typing rapidly on her terminal, pulling up academic databases and publication records. Maybe, actually. There's this professor at Oxford back on Earth. His name is Tyler Hayes. He's published extensively over the years on linguistic evolution and mythological connections across completely different ancient cultures. His work is generally considered, well, let's say eccentric would be the polite academic term. Eccentric in what way specifically? Zixtara asked. He argues that many different ancient myths from cultures that supposedly never had contact with each other actually have common roots and origins. He claims that stories and ideas passed between distant civilizations much more than conventional historical understanding accepts as possible. He's traced linguistic patterns across Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Chinese, and even pre-Columbian American languages, suggesting there was way more cultural contact and exchange than mainstream academics believe happened. Most professional historians and linguists think he's reaching too far, connecting dots and patterns that don't actually exist. Crix's eyes practically gleamed with interest. Or perhaps he sees genuine patterns that others are simply missing or refusing to acknowledge. Contact this Professor Tyler Hayes immediately. Right now. 10,000 kilometers away, in a cramped, cluttered office at Oxford University, Professor Tyler Hayes was experiencing what he genuinely believed was the absolute worst day of his entire professional career. His latest research paper, titled Linguistic Bridges, Tracing the Proto-Euphrates Language Family Across Continental Divides, had just been rejected for the third time by the Journal of Ancient Languages. The editor's response note was polite but ultimately dismissive. While your enthusiasm for the subject matter is certainly admirable, the evidence presented does not adequately support such sweeping conclusions about ancient cultural contact patterns. Tyler sat there staring at his office walls, which were completely covered in printouts of cuneiform tablets, Chinese oracle bones, Egyptian hieroglyphics, all connected together by red string like he was some kind of conspiracy theorist having a mental breakdown. Maybe everyone else was right after all. Maybe he really was just chasing ghosts and shadows, seeing meaningful connections where there were only random coincidences. His computer terminal suddenly chimed with an incoming message marked Priority 1, Galactic Council. Tyler blinked in confusion. He'd never received any kind of message from the Galactic Council before. He wasn't even completely sure why they would ever need to contact him directly. He opened the message and started reading. Then he read it again, more slowly. Then he sat back in his chair and started laughing, a slightly hysterical sound that echoed off the walls of his empty office. They wanted him to find an ancient dragon's true name, hidden somewhere in humanity's fragmented historical records. A name preserved only in the exact kind of linguistic patterns he'd spent 20 years of his life mapping and documenting, the same patterns that every other academic dismissed as meaningless coincidence. His entire career, everything that had been dismissed as obsessive and impractical and basically the academic equivalent of tilting at windmills, might suddenly become the single most important work in the entire galaxy. Tyler pulled up his personal databases, decades worth of carefully compiled research that he'd cross-referenced and indexed according to systems that only he fully understood. If the name existed anywhere in human records, buried and corrupted by 4,000 years of linguistic drift and cultural transformation, he would find it. He cracked his knuckles and started typing furiously. "All right, Ancient One," he muttered to himself with a grin. "Let's see if humanity actually remembered." 3 weeks into the search, the investigation had turned into an absolute circus. Every single amateur historian, conspiracy theorist, and attention seeker in human-controlled space had suddenly crawled out of the woodwork claiming they knew Vraxthos's true name. The Galactic Council had been forced to process over 10,000 different submissions. Every single one of them had been completely wrong. Some people submitted names pulled straight out of fantasy novels they'd read. Others just strung together random syllables that sounded vaguely ancient or mysterious. A few had submitted genuine historical names from Earth's past, but none of them predated Vraxthos's visit to the solar system, so they couldn't possibly be correct. Tensions were rising across the galaxy. The lunar cycle that Vraxthos had given them was already half over, and they weren't any closer to finding an answer than they'd been on day one. Professor Tyler Hayes had barely slept at all during those 3 weeks. His office had been completely transformed into what looked like a detective's war room from an old movie. Holographic displays floated in midair everywhere, showing complex linguistic family trees, ancient astronomical charts, and detailed timelines cross-referenced with significant historical events. His graduate assistant, a sharp young woman named Casey, had essentially moved into the department to keep him supplied with endless coffee and to make absolutely sure he remembered to eat something at least once a day. "You seriously need to get some rest," Casey said for what had to be the 20th time that week. "I can't, not yet. There's a pattern buried in all this data somewhere, I can feel it in my bones." Tyler zoomed in on a section of an ancient Babylonian star chart that dated back to approximately 2000 BCE. "Look right here. They recorded what they called an unusual celestial event. They specifically described it as the serpent that walks between stars. The physical description matches perfectly with what we know about Vraxthos's appearance and his bioluminescence. That's literally the 15th different serpent or dragon reference you've shown me this week," Casey pointed out gently. "Pretty much every ancient culture on Earth had some kind of dragon or serpent mythology. That's not exactly unique or unusual." "Yes, but this particular one moved across the sky," Tyler said excitedly. "It changed its position over the course of several days. That's not a constellation that stays in one place. That's a direct observation of something actually traveling through physical space." He pulled up another ancient document on a different screen. "And look at this. Chinese oracle bone inscriptions from the Shang dynasty, dated to almost exactly the same time period. They make reference to something they called Yinglong, which translates roughly to the responding dragon, and they specifically say it appeared in the northern section of the sky and stayed visible for weeks." "Responding to what, though?" Casey asked. "That's exactly what I'm desperately trying to figure out." Tyler rubbed his tired eyes hard. "But there's something else I noticed that's really interesting. Look at these Sumerian tablets from that same general time period. They mention something they describe as a star that spoke. And they don't mean that metaphorically or poetically. They describe it as actual, literal communication happening. Dragons can't possibly speak across the vacuum of space, Tyler. Sound doesn't travel in a vacuum, that's basic physics. Vraxthos isn't a normal biological dragon, though. He's a spacefaring entity who somehow managed to survive for millions of years in conditions that would instantly kill almost any other living thing. According to the briefing materials the Galactic Council sent us, his species has natural biological radio transmission capabilities built right into their bodies. It's how they communicate across vast distances. Tyler was typing furiously now, pulling up multiple databases and documents simultaneously. So what if he actually did try to communicate with ancient humans? What if some people back then somehow heard him? How would that even be possible? We didn't have radio receivers 4,000 years ago. We barely had bronze tools. No technological radio receivers, you're right. But what if we had shamans, priests, spiritually sensitive individuals who claimed they could hear the voices of gods and spirits? What if some humans were just naturally sensitive to the specific frequencies that Vraxthos was broadcasting on? What if they really did hear him somehow, interpreted what they heard through their existing cultural and religious framework, and then tried to preserve that experience for future generations? Casey sat down slowly, her expression thoughtful. That's incredibly speculative, Tyler. Like, really reaching. Everything about this entire situation is wildly speculative, Tyler countered. I'm searching for an alien dragon's name that might be preserved in 4,000-year-old human records. Speculation is literally all we have to work with. He brought up a new search window, this time combining multiple different databases at once. I'm specifically looking now for any historical reference to humans claiming they communicated directly with a celestial serpent or dragon, dated to the correct time period, that includes anything at all that could possibly be interpreted as an actual name rather than just a title or description. The search algorithm ran for several long minutes while they both held their breath. Then results started slowly populating across the screen. 17 possible matches appeared. Tyler immediately started going through them one by one, eliminating obvious false positives. He got rid of 13 almost instantly because they were either from the wrong time period entirely, had physical descriptions that didn't match Vraxthos at all, or were clearly metaphorical or purely mythological rather than based on actual observations. That left exactly 4 potentially viable references. Tyler examined each one with meticulous care, pulling up the original source materials and translation notes. The first was an Egyptian religious text that described the god Set speaking to humans through a serpent that appeared in the night sky. It was poetic and atmospheric but frustratingly nonspecific about actual details. The second was a fragmentary Chinese text that mentioned Yinglong teaching a young prince the secret names of heaven and earth. That seemed closer to what they needed, but when Tyler dug deeper, the so-called names turned out to actually be traditional Chinese designations for various constellations. The third was a Sumerian tablet that was so badly damaged and fragmentary that only 3 words were still legible enough to translate with any confidence. But the fourth reference made Tyler sit up ramrod straight in his chair, his heart suddenly pounding. Casey, I need you to pull up everything we have in our database about the ancient city-state of Yor, specifically from around 2000 BCE. Focus on religious texts, anything related to celestial worship or astronomical observations. What did you find? Casey asked, immediately moving to another terminal. Maybe nothing at all. Or maybe absolutely everything we've been looking for. Tyler zoomed in on the ancient text, his hands actually shaking slightly. This is a partially translated cuneiform tablet that was originally discovered back in the 1920s. Most mainstream archaeologists dismissed it as purely religious mythology with no historical basis. It describes a young boy, the son of a priest, who claimed that a celestial serpent actually landed somewhere near the city and spoke directly to him in words he could somehow understand. And according to the translation, the tablet explicitly says that this child learned the serpent's actual name. It's written right here in the cuneiform, but the characters are partially damaged and the original translator noted that the pronunciation was highly uncertain and might not be accurate. Tyler pulled up images of the original cuneiform symbols. The academic who first translated this rendered the name as something like Veraktosh, but he specifically noted in his translation notes that he wasn't confident about the pronunciation at all due to the damaged state of the physical tablet. Casey leaned in closer to look at the screen. That kind of sounds a little bit like Vraxthos, doesn't it? It absolutely does, Tyler said, his excitement growing. But here's the thing you have to understand. Cuneiform writing wasn't designed or intended to capture all possible human speech sounds, and it definitely wasn't created to write down alien names. If a Bronze Age human child actually heard the name Vraxthos spoken out loud by the dragon himself and then tried their best to write it down using the only writing system they knew, which was Sumerian cuneiform, and then we account for 4,000 years of linguistic drift and changes in how modern scholars pronounce ancient cuneiform. He quickly pulled up his linguistic analysis software and started running calculations, working backwards through documented language evolution, adjusting for known sound shifts over time and the orthographic limitations of ancient writing systems. The final result appeared on the screen, Vraxthos with an 87% phonetic accuracy match. Tyler and Casey just stared at each other in stunned silence for a long moment. We need more evidence than this, Casey finally said, being the voice of reason. One single damaged tablet isn't going to be enough. The Galactic Council will just dismiss it as an interesting coincidence. You're absolutely right, Tyler agreed. But here's what I'm thinking. If the name really was preserved somehow in ancient Sumerian texts, and if there really was significant cross-cultural contact and exchange during the Bronze Age like I've been arguing for years, then the name might appear in other places too. Transformed by different languages, corrupted by time and distance, but still fundamentally present in the linguistic record. He immediately began searching through Chinese historical texts for anything that was even remotely phonetically similar to either Vraxthos or Verektosh. Then he moved on to Egyptian records. Then Proto-Indo-European linguistic reconstructions. Hours passed in intense concentration. Casey had fallen asleep in her chair, exhausted, when Tyler suddenly stood up so fast he knocked over his cup of cold coffee, sending it clattering across his desk. "I found it," he whispered, barely able to believe it himself. "I actually found it." He'd successfully traced the name through 4 completely different linguistic traditions, each one transforming it according to their own specific phonetic rules and writing system limitations, but all of them preserving the core syllables in recognizable form. The Sumerian Verektosh had become something pronounced like Huola Kasi in ancient Chinese texts that discussed Yinglong. That same name appeared as Rakash in one fragmentary Egyptian hieroglyphic text that most scholars had dismissed as corrupted writing. And all of these bore striking similarity to how Proto-Indo-European speakers would have naturally reconstructed those particular syllables based on their language rules, eventually leading back to a pronunciation remarkably, unmistakably close to Vraxthos. The name had survived across 4,000 years. Fragmented, scattered across completely different cultures and writing systems, preserved in myths and ancient tablets that modern academics dismissed as unrelated coincidences. But it had survived. Tyler immediately composed a detailed message to the Galactic Council, carefully attaching all of his research, cross-references, and linguistic analysis. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely hit the send button. Then he sat back down in his chair and just waited, his heart pounding. Across the galaxy, on the crystalline moon of Cathay, Vraxthos stirred slightly in his resting place. "They found it," he murmured softly to the empty chamber around him. "I knew they would eventually. Humans never forget a name. They never forget a kindness, no matter how small." His ancient eyes slowly closed again, but now he was simply waiting patiently, not actively dying. Not yet anyway. The response from the Galactic Council came back within just a few hours, which was incredibly fast considering the bureaucratic nightmare that galactic government usually was. The message was simple and direct. Professor Tyler Hayes was to report to the moon of Cathay immediately, no delays, no excuses. Tyler suddenly found himself on a military transport ship, still wearing the same rumpled clothes he'd been living in for 3 straight weeks of obsessive research. He was flying through space at speeds that would have seemed like pure magic to him just a few days ago. But now, all he could think about was whether his linguistic analysis was actually correct, and what would happen if he was wrong. The weight of potentially disappointing the entire galaxy pressed down on him like a physical thing. Investigator Crix met him the moment he stepped off the ship onto the landing platform. All 8 of her eyes studied him with an intensity that Tyler found genuinely unnerving, like she was looking straight through him and analyzing everything about him at once. "Professor Hayes," she said formally, "your research documentation is remarkably impressive and thorough." "Thank you, though I really should point out that none of this would have been possible without the collaborative work of literally hundreds of archaeologists, linguists, translators, and historians who came before me and did the hard work of." "Save the academic humility for later," Crix interrupted him, but her tone wasn't unkind. "The Council has already reviewed all of your findings in detail. Your methodology is extremely sound and well-reasoned. But having sound methodology doesn't automatically guarantee correct results, as I'm sure you know. We need absolute certainty here, or as close to it as we can possibly get." "I can't offer you absolute certainty," Tyler admitted honestly, feeling his stomach twist with anxiety. "Only a very high probability based on all the available evidence I could find. The linguistic degradation patterns are entirely consistent with what would expect from 4,000 years of cultural transmission and language evolution. The phonetic preservation across multiple completely different language families strongly suggests they all had a common original source. And the timeline matches up perfectly with Vraxthos's documented passage through our solar system. But could I be wrong? Yes, I absolutely could be wrong. But you don't think you are?" "No, I don't think I'm wrong. But I've been wrong about things before." Crix made a gesture with one of her appendages that Tyler's translation device rendered as approval or respect. "Good. Scientists who claim absolute certainty about everything are usually the ones who are most spectacularly wrong. Come with me now. The Ancient One is waiting, and we shouldn't keep him any longer. The walk to the ceremonial chamber felt like it took forever and no time at all simultaneously. Tyler's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The chamber itself was absolutely enormous, big enough to hold several football stadiums, and Vraxthos was so much more magnificent and simultaneously more terrifying than Tyler had imagined from pictures and video feeds. Even while dying, clearly weakened and fading, the dragon radiated raw power that made every instinct Tyler had scream at him to turn around and run as fast as he possibly could. But he walked forward anyway, one foot in front of the other, forcing himself to keep moving. Representatives from dozens of different species lined the chamber walls on both sides, watching everything with expressions that ranged from hopeful anticipation to obvious skepticism to what looked like outright hostility. Ambassador Krell stood prominently at the front of the crowd, his reptilian features twisted into what Tyler assumed was an expression of complete disdain and contempt. "This is the human?" Krell hissed loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This disheveled academic who studies dead languages? This is supposed to be our salvation?" "This is Professor Tyler Hayes," Arbiter Thelnox said with formal dignity, his crystalline body catching the light. "Who has provided the most compelling and well-researched evidence we've seen yet of genuine knowledge concerning the Ancient One's true name." "Evidence is not the same thing as actual knowledge," Krell countered aggressively. "How do we know he's not simply making an educated guess? Or that his entire linguistic theory isn't just an elaborate fabrication designed to get attention?" Before anyone else could respond to that accusation, Vraxthos himself stirred. His absolutely massive eyes slowly opened, focusing directly on Tyler with an intensity that made the professor's knees go weak and nearly buckle under him. "Come closer, small one," the dragon's voice rumbled through the chamber like distant thunder. Tyler walked forward on legs that were shaking badly, forcing himself to keep going until he stood directly in front of the dragon's enormous head. Up close, this close, he could clearly see the incredibly intricate patterns covering Vraxthos' scales. They looked almost like some form of written script in an alien language he'd never seen before, like the dragon's entire body was covered in stories written directly onto his skin. "You have something you want to tell me?" Vraxthos said. It wasn't really a question. "I do, yes, Ancient One." Tyler swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. "I believe I've successfully traced your name through human historical records spanning 4,000 years. It was preserved across multiple different cultures, transformed significantly by natural linguistic evolution over time, but the core phonetic elements were retained in our collective memory and written records." "Interesting," the dragon said, and his enormous eyes seemed to gleam with something that might have been amusement. "And what exactly led you to this conclusion? Walk me through your reasoning." Tyler explained his entire research process, starting with the Babylonian tablets and moving through the Chinese oracle bones and the cross-cultural linguistic connections that conventional mainstream academics usually dismissed as meaningless coincidence or wishful thinking. As he spoke, he gradually became more animated and confident, his genuine passion for his work starting to override his fear of the massive creature in front of him. "But here's what's truly remarkable about all of this," Tyler continued, really getting into it now. "The name wasn't just preserved in formal religious texts and official astronomical records. It actually appears in children's stories from various different Bronze Age cultures. Tales about a kind, wise serpent who came from the sky and taught humans important wisdom and knowledge. All of these stories have remarkably similar elements when you look at them closely: a child who showed absolutely no fear, an offering of water given freely, a sharing of names between the child and the serpent. Mainstream historians have always dismissed these as pure mythology, fairy tales with no basis in reality. But what if they weren't myths at all? What if they were actually attempts by ancient people to preserve and pass down the memory of a real event that actually happened?" Vraxthos made a deep sound that might have been a laugh, though it rattled Tyler's bones. "What indeed? And tell me, Professor Hayes, what name did you ultimately find in all of your research?" This was it. The moment everything had been building toward. Tyler pulled up his tablet computer, showing the complete linguistic reconstruction he'd painstakingly built. Based primarily on Sumerian cuneiform tablets dating to approximately 2000 BCE, carefully cross-referenced with ancient Chinese oracle bone inscriptions, Egyptian hieroglyphic texts, and Proto-Indo-European linguistic reconstruction, and accounting for roughly 4,000 years of natural phonetic drift and sound changes across multiple language families. He paused, took a deep breath, then spoke as carefully and precisely as he could, pronouncing each syllable exactly the way his reconstruction suggested a Bronze Age human would have originally spoken it. Not in any modern language, but in an approximation of how the sounds would have been naturally preserved and passed down across different cultures. Vraxthos. The entire chamber fell into complete, absolute silence. You could have heard a pin drop. The dragon's eye slowly closed. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, absolutely nothing happened at all. Tyler felt his heart sink down into his stomach. He'd been wrong after all. All those connections he'd seen were just coincidences like everyone had always told him. He'd let his obsession and desperation lead him down a path to wrong, Vraxthos said softly, almost gently. Tyler felt the crushing weight of every single eye in that chamber focusing on him at once. Complete, utter failure. He'd failed himself, failed humanity, failed the entire galaxy. But, Vraxthos continued, and suddenly his eye opened again, now glowing noticeably brighter than before. You're only wrong in the same way that a young child is wrong when they can't quite pronounce a difficult word perfectly yet. You have the sound, Professor Hayes. You've remembered it across 4,000 years of chaos and change. But you haven't actually heard how the name should truly sound when spoken correctly. The dragon began to speak his own name, but not in Galactic Common or any spoken language that Tyler recognized. He spoke it in what must have been the ancient sonic language of his own species. It wasn't just sound waves moving through air. It was vibration across multiple different frequencies simultaneously. Some parts were audible to human ears, some Tyler felt resonating in his bones and chest cavity, and some existed in spectrums that humans couldn't naturally perceive at all but that he somehow still sensed happening. But Tyler, standing so incredibly close to the source, heard all of it. Every layer, every harmonic, every overtone. The way the name contained within its very structure the essence of who Vraxthos actually was as an individual being. Not just syllables strung together, but identity itself, encoded in pure sound and vibration. And suddenly, in that moment, Tyler understood something profound. The Bronze Age child who'd first heard this name all those millennia ago hadn't learned it perfectly. How could they possibly? They were human, with human ears and a human voice and human limitations. They'd captured what their ears could physically hear, what their throat and mouth could actually produce, what their primitive writing system could possibly preserve on clay tablets. They'd done their absolute best to honor the gift of a name that had been shared with them in friendship. And somehow, miraculously, across 4,000 years of human history, through the rise and fall of entire civilizations, through countless wars and disasters and cultural transformations, through linguistic evolution that had completely changed how humans spoke and wrote, through fragmentations and corruptions and retellings, humans had kept that name alive. Imperfect, yes. Changed, absolutely. But alive. When the sound finally faded away into silence, Tyler realized there were tears running freely down his face. I understand now, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I can't speak your name the way you do. No human possibly can. Our bodies aren't built for it. But we remembered anyway. Across all that time and distance and change, we kept the story alive. We didn't forget you. Yes, Vraxthos said, and his voice was warm now, almost tender in a way that seemed impossible for such a massive creature. And that, Professor Tyler Hayes, is exactly why I specifically asked for a human to be brought to me. Not because your species knows my name perfectly, because obviously no species except my own can speak it in its true form. But because humans cannot forget. You cling to stories like they're the most precious treasures in existence. You preserve knowledge that seems completely useless and impractical to everyone else. You maintain connections that appear meaningless. You remember acts of kindness across countless generations. The dragon shifted his enormous body slightly, and his attention moved away from Tyler to sweep across all the assembled representatives watching from the sides of the chamber. 4,000 years ago by human reckoning, Vraxthos began, his voice filling the entire space. I landed on a small blue world to rest and heal. I had been injured in a territorial dispute with another of my kind, and I needed time to recover. I expected absolutely no contact with the primitive bipedal beings I had observed from orbit. They were barely past the Stone Age by galactic standards. They had just figured out how to work with bronze and copper. They were nothing, irrelevant to someone like me. The dragon paused, and Tyler could have sworn he saw something like a smile cross those ancient features. But a child found me anyway. Small, fragile, utterly powerless by any measure that matters in galactic civilization. This child could have been killed by the slightest movement of my tail. And yet this child showed absolutely no fear. They approached me carrying a simple clay vessel, crudely made, filled with water from a nearby river. They offered it to me. They sat down beside me in the dust and just kept me company. And then, in the most natural way imaginable, this child asked me my name and shared their own name in return, like we were equals, like my age and power meant nothing compared to basic courtesy between two living beings. You could have heard a pin drop in that massive chamber. Every representative was listening with complete attention now. I told that child my name, Vraxthos continued. It was a gift given freely, with absolutely no expectation that it would ever matter or mean anything in the grand scheme of things. I stayed for a short time, healed my injuries, and then I left. I returned to my travels through the cosmos. Centuries passed, then millennia. I watched entire empires rise from nothing and then crumble into dust. I witnessed the birth of new stars and the death of old ones. And somewhere along the way, I completely forgot about that one small human child on that one unremarkable little world. But they didn't forget me, the dragon said, and there was something like wonder in his voice. They told the story to other people. It was carefully written on clay tablets that were then baked hard to preserve them. It was carved into oracle bones. It was passed down through endless generations of oral storytellers. The name was corrupted and transformed and scattered across your species' chaotic, disorganized development process. But it was never actually lost. It survived. And when I called out asking for a human who knew my name, I was really asking a much deeper question. Has humanity retained the quality I observed in that one child 4,000 years ago? The tendency to remember things that seem completely unimportant? The need to honor small connections and kindnesses across absolutely vast expanses of time? The dragon's gaze swept across every face in the chamber, human and alien alike. And the answer, as we can all clearly see now, is yes. Absolutely yes. The chamber immediately erupted into heated discussion. Some species representatives sounded skeptical, others genuinely fascinated by what they were hearing, and Krell still radiated obvious hostility and suspicion. But Arbiter Thelnox raised one of his crystalline appendages high, calling for silence and order. Ancient One, Thelnox said with great formality and respect, the human has clearly satisfied your requirement in a way that none of us fully expected. Will you now share your final knowledge with us as you promised? I will, Vraxthos said firmly. But first, I have another question. Professor Hayes, tell me something. Why did you personally choose to become a scholar of dead languages and forgotten civilizations? What drives you to spend your life studying fragments of the past that your own society largely considers impractical and pointless? Tyler was genuinely taken aback by such a personal question being asked in front of this massive audience. I grew up listening to my grandmother tell stories. She came from a small rural community, and she knew tales and legends that had been passed down in her family for generations. Origin stories, moral tales, historical accounts preserved purely through oral tradition. She used to tell me that every single story we allow to be lost forever is a piece of our collective self that we can never, ever get back. I suppose I've spent my entire career trying to prove that she was right about that. And are there many other humans like you? Who think the way you do? More than most people realize, actually. We have archaeologists who dedicate their entire lives to excavating ruins and settlements that nobody else cares about anymore. Linguists who travel to remote places to record and preserve dying languages that are only spoken by a handful of elderly people. Historians who study civilizations that have been forgotten for thousands of years. Anthropologists who carefully document cultures that are on the verge of complete extinction. To most regular people living their normal lives, we're completely impractical dreamers wasting our time. But all of us believe deeply that the past matters. That connections matter. That even the smallest, most insignificant seeming story deserves to be remembered and preserved. Fascinating, Vraxthos said thoughtfully. Now listen carefully, all of you. I have lived for 10 million years. I have personally witnessed the rise and eventual fall of 4 to 7 major galactic civilizations. Some of you represent species that are descendants of those fallen civilizations. Do you want to know what every single one of them had in common? What united them all in their eventual collapse? The dragon's voice grew noticeably stronger, more powerful. They forgot. Every single one of them forgot who they were and where they came from. They became so intensely focused on the future, on endless expansion, on technological advancement, on accumulating power and resources, that they completely stopped remembering and honoring their past. They systematically abandoned their origin stories, their cultural traditions, their connections to their ancestors and their homeworlds. They optimized absolutely everything in their societies, made every single process efficient and streamlined and productive, and in doing so they lost all the inefficient, impractical, seemingly useless knowledge that actually made them who they were as a people. And then when the great inevitable cycles of galactic history inevitably turned against them, when genuine crisis came, they had no foundation left to stand on. No stories to guide them through the darkness. No memory of how their ancestors had survived similar challenges in the distant past. They fell, every single one of them, into either complete extinction or catastrophic collapse. Vraxthos focused his intense gaze directly on Tyler again. But humans are different. You remember things. Inefficiently, yes. Chaotically and randomly, absolutely. Imperfectly, without question. But you remember anyway. You compulsively preserve knowledge that seems to have no practical use whatsoever. You honor connections and relationships that span multiple generations. You are quite possibly the most impractical, inefficient, disorganized species I have ever personally encountered in 10 million years of existence. And that beautiful chaos is precisely why you just might actually survive what is coming for the rest of the galaxy. What exactly is coming? Thelnox asked, and there was clear concern in his translated voice now. The galaxy enters a massive dark age approximately every 50 million years, Vraxthos explained calmly. It's a convergence of multiple catastrophic factors happening simultaneously. The galactic magnetic field shifts dramatically. Certain types of stars go supernova in concentrated clusters. Extragalactic radiation bombardment increases exponentially. Hyperspace lanes become unstable and dangerous. Civilizations collapse one after another like dominoes falling. Technology fails on a massive scale. The great powerful species fall completely silent. I have personally survived 2 such dark ages already. The third one is approaching within the next 10,000 years, which I know seems like a long time to most of you, but in cosmic terms it's practically tomorrow. The chamber instantly filled with alarmed sounds and agitated movement from multiple different species all at once. But there is a way to endure and survive it, Vraxthos continued over the noise. Not through advanced technology alone, because sophisticated technology consistently fails during the Dark Age. Not through military might, because there's no physical enemy to fight against. You endure through memory. Through actively preserving the accumulated knowledge of how to rebuild civilization from scratch. Through consciously maintaining connections across vast time that can outlast any single generation or even any single species. The Dragon's Eye found Tyler once again. Humans are newcomers to the galactic stage. You've been traveling through space for merely 2 centuries, which is nothing, an eye blink. But your species has survived for hundreds of thousands of years on a death world that should have destroyed you a dozen times over through ice ages, supervolcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, global pandemics, and your own incredible violence toward each other. Professor Hayes, do you understand how your species actually survived all of that? Tyler thought about his grandmother's stories, about the archaeological record he'd studied his whole life, about languages and cultures preserving crucial knowledge across thousands of years through nothing but human determination. We told stories to each other, he said quietly but firmly. We passed down knowledge from generation to generation. We remembered what worked and what didn't. We learned from our ancestors' mistakes. We remembered. Exactly right, Vraxthos said, and his scales began to glow noticeably brighter, more vibrant. While other species optimized themselves for maximum efficiency and in the process forgot their own pasts, humans remained beautifully, chaotically inefficient. You waste enormous amounts of time on art and music and storytelling that has no survival value. You study history obsessively even when it has no practical application to current problems. You name your spacecraft after ancient heroes who died thousands of years ago. You name your children after grandparents and great-grandparents to maintain family connections. You become emotionally attached to random objects and specific places for purely sentimental reasons. By any reasonable measure of galactic civilization standards, you are hopelessly, ridiculously impractical. Vraxthos paused for dramatic effect. And that inefficiency, that beautiful impractical chaos, is exactly why I am now formally naming humanity as the next official memory keepers of the galaxy. The pronouncement hit like a physical shockwave. Representatives started shouting, arguing, gesturing wildly. What authority do you have to? Krell started to object loudly. I am the last surviving member of the previous memory keeper species, Vraxthos interrupted with absolute authority. My kind held this sacred role for 7 million years. We preserved the crucial knowledge of all the civilizations that came before us, maintained it safely through multiple dark ages, so that the galaxy could eventually rebuild itself. But my species is gone now. Extinct. I am the last one left. I must pass this responsibility, this mantle, to another species before I die. And I choose humans. You're choosing humans, one of the Tulare scholars pulsed with obvious incredulity. A species that can't even maintain consistent, reliable records for 5,000 years? That's absurd. I choose humans precisely because they can't maintain perfect consistent records, Vraxthos said firmly. Because they preserve crucial knowledge in songs and stories and art and cultural traditions just as much as in computer databases. Because they remember things emotionally and spiritually as well as intellectually. When your perfect digital archives are completely destroyed in the Dark Age, when your sophisticated storage systems catastrophically fail, when your magnificent libraries burn to ashes, humans will still have their stories. Imperfect, transformed, but alive and growing. Vraxthos looked at Tyler with what could only be described as affection. Professor Hayes, you found my name not through accessing perfect historical records, but through painstakingly piecing together fragments scattered across multiple different cultures, preserved in forms that seemed like unrelated mythology to everyone else. That ability, that particular skill, is exactly what the galaxy is going to desperately need. The ability to recognize fundamental truth hidden inside stories. To find meaningful patterns in apparent chaos. To reconstruct lost knowledge from broken fragments. But I'm just one person, Tyler protested, feeling overwhelmed. I can't possibly. You're not alone, and you never will be. Your entire species shares this trait. You can't help but remember things. Even when you actively try to forget your traumas, your terrible mistakes, your painful past, you end up preserving those memories anyway in art, in literature, in cultural traditions and rituals. You carry history in your fundamental psychology. The dragon's glow intensified even further. I will now share with you the accumulated knowledge of 7 million years of memory keeping. Not the faster-than-light mathematics I mentioned, that was merely bait to ensure the council would take my request seriously. I'm going to share something infinitely more valuable than technology, the complete history of 4 to 7 fallen civilizations. How they rose from nothing. How they reached their peak. How they fell into ruin. The patterns that repeat endlessly across the cycles of galactic history. The tested methods of preserving knowledge successfully through dark ages. The wisdom that absolutely must not be lost. Vraxthos looked at everyone assembled. All species may learn this knowledge that I'm about to share. But humanity will be its primary keepers, its guardians. When the Dark Age finally comes, when your civilizations collapse and your technologies fail, seek out the humans. Find them wherever they are. They will remember for you. They will guide you through the darkness. They will help you rebuild. Tyler approached as close as he dared. Vraxthos lowered his massive head. This will be extremely uncomfortable. I'm going to share memories directly with you, mind to mind. 7 million years of knowledge compressed into a form your human brain can hold. You won't remember all of it consciously. Most of it will be buried deep in your subconscious mind, emerging only when it's needed. But it will be there, and you'll be able to pass it on to others. I'm ready, Tyler said. Vraxthos's eyes erupted with brilliant light that flooded directly into Tyler's mind. Images, sounds, feelings, concepts, an overwhelming flood of information. He saw the rise of civilizations that had existed millions of years before humans evolved. He witnessed the patterns of history repeating across incomprehensible time scales. He understood the cycles that govern galactic development. And he saw how it would end. How the Dark Age would come. How civilizations would fall. How only those who remembered would survive to rebuild. When it was finally over, Tyler collapsed completely, gasping for air. Casey rushed forward to support him. It's done, Vraxthos whispered, his voice barely audible now. The knowledge is preserved. Humanity will remember for all of us. Tyler looked up at the dying dragon through tears. We will. I promise you, we will. Vraxthos the Eternal closed his eyes for the final time. His breathing gradually slowed, then stopped completely. The bioluminescent patterns along his scales flickered once, twice, then went permanently dark. The last of the ancient memory keepers was gone. But the knowledge lived on, carried now by a species that could not forget. 10 years later, Professor Tyler Hayes stood before an amphitheater packed with students, both human and alien, at Earth's newly established Institute for Galactic Memory. Today, he began with a smile, I'm going to tell you a story about a dragon and a child who met 4,000 years ago. The knowledge Vraxthos had given him was being carefully compiled, thoroughly studied, and widely shared. Human scholars worked side by side with alien researchers, preserving everything in multiple different formats. Digital archives, yes, but also in songs that people sang, in stories that parents told their children, in artworks that captured essential truths, in traditions and rituals that communities practiced together. Redundant, inefficient, beautifully and chaotically human. And across the galaxy, other species watched humanity work with a complicated mixture of bemusement and genuine hope. Maybe the dragon had been right after all. Maybe the galaxy's most impractical, chaotic species was exactly what it needed to survive. Maybe remembering was the single most important skill in the entire universe.